The Skid Row History Museum and Archive is a project of the illustrious Los Angeles Poverty Department, which started out as a performance group at Skid Row 40 years ago. So we're gonna precede the main event with a special 3-minute performance, because we're also making a performance. Basically, let's see. Yeah, so this wall is the beginning of an exhibition that Rosten's making here. This conversation is going to feed into what goes on to the next wall. So it's past, present, and then we're going to get the future eventually. But we're also making performance stuff about it, and so we're going to have a 3-minute fabulous extravaganza right now.
Okay.
Tom Brody and Aaron Donato.
Hello.
Yeah, I am.
Hey. What I believe we need in SRO housing is security.
Yes.
Security of having my food delivered. Security of having my application processed completely. Security of having a phone to get codes for the final step for any completion. Security of having a Wi-Fi internet in my home that is not hacked by the 44-year-old wire coming into the building. Security of not having my neighbors sell their Wi-Fi hotspots to the drug dealers and addicts out front the door so that they block the front doorway. Security 24/7 of having someone check the cameras for the 3 times that I was beaten in front of my building, and almost last week as well, so that they can enter and hang these people that are blocking our doorway. And also they go into the building, they gum the doorway and go out to the back alleyway. We need security. Security of having someone who removes the vagrants from the building. Security of having the front door not being broken 9 times in 1 year.
So I went to Subway for their $7.99 meal of the day.
Oh, that's good. Good.
Some of you know this. And unfortunately, they added a $2 security deposit to it. $7.99, $8.76 with tax, and now an additional $2. I'm like, come on, that doesn't make sense. Doesn't need to be protected. It's a sandwich. I bought it. I eat it. It's gone.
Gone. Security on a sandwich? Oh my God. I want security of having our washer and dryers working properly and having block those schmucks who break the machines for the chunk change. I want security of having a manager that may stay maybe 3-5 years instead of having 9 managers in just 1 year. A security of having a safe building without the addicts and the vagrants running around through the hallways, the back alleyways, and blocking the front door. Security of having a dry floor in my room because the neighbor's upstairs toilet was leaking and I needed an umbrella to go into the bathroom. Security of not having my wall fall down because of the leaking that they're getting fixed in the bathroom and also in my living room. Security of being able to stop the upstairs neighbors from stomping on the floor with their wooden leg that she loves to hear the sounds and she's screaming with her boyfriend because she's in this goddamn relationship that's abusive and she crashed the windows and I had to call the cops and then she was arrested, but now I've met her and she's really sweet. So I can't, it's really hard on women because women, they get into a relationship. So anyway, security of feeling secure. Security of not having my room broken in 3 times and nobody looking at the camera.
A $2 security
deposit
on the meal of the day? Come on, why? Well, they told me they have safety issues in the restaurant, so the $2 security deposit goes towards paying the security guard. And I said, well, why am I getting that put on me? I'm getting this to go.
And you already ate it. Security for eating food. Security of not being beaten for my phone 3 times while waiting for access or lift in front of my building. Security of not having my neighbor call the cops on me 10 times and also the veteran next stairs, even though I have a restraining order against him because he follows me to LAPD. I want security.
So that's how my 2026 began. $2 security deposit for the subway meal of the day.
Security.
I would love to blame the Trump administration, but I don't think I can.
Security! Take your job.
And it's always just really great to be here and great to see the crowd. I'm like one of those people who always, no matter what, has like this like fear of like, what if no one comes to my party? And so it's always really great when, you know, even though every time I've done an event here, there's always tons of folks, and it's always just so lovely to see you. And it's one of my favorite places to do anything. So my name is Rosten Woo, and I'm working with very exciting. And I love working with Los Angeles Highway Department and the Skid Row Housing Museum and Archive. So the idea of this show, Hotels in Crisis, again, began with the idea that we have this kind of incredible archive of materials from the 80s during a particular moment when residential hotels in Skid Row were in a crisis. And that was resolved in a lot of ways by the creation of nonprofit entities like Skid Row Housing Trust. And that has a lot to say. That moment might have a lot to say to this moment, where we see a lot of those organizations and institutions under incredible strain, if not fatal strain, and figuring out, you know, where do we go from here? What do we do? And another vital component of it is the work of the Los Angeles Tenant Union that have been working in SROs downtown for quite a while, and they meet here in this space on Wednesdays, and trying to figure out with them, you know, what would actually be a meaningful way to use this time in this space going forward. So one of the things we thought could be really interesting is assembling this panel to talk about, you know, the present. If we have sort of like this, you know, sort of false trichotomy of past, present, and future, but it's still useful to think about it that way. Our last event was about the past. This event is about the present, and our third event in early March will be about the future. But this panel has a bunch of folks who are, I'd say, you know, true experts on this topic. I'm going to read some bios from my phone since I forgot my printout at home. But so from left, or I guess no, from
That
right.
side?
That's like that side.
Yeah. Well, okay. From that side, you understand. From that side towards me, I'm going to introduce these folks. So first over there we have Jerry Jones, who is with the Greater LA Coalition on Homelessness, which is a network of 61 community-based organizations on the front lines of homelessness, and they engage those organizations with elected officials on homelessness policy making. And previously, Jerry Jones was the National Field Director of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And I think last time you were on a panel here, that was your that was your bio, so some time has passed. Next we have Marc, and I should have asked this, Tousignant?
Yeah.
Tousignant, who's the Director of Supportive Housing at Enterprise Community Partners in Southern California. He leads the homelessness and supportive housing initiatives for Enterprise's Southern California market, currently directing a permanent supportive housing preservation initiative and systems change effort to strengthen the permanent housing component of the coordinated entry system in Los Angeles. And perhaps he will explain what that means during one of his responses. Before Enterprise, he served as Senior Program Manager at Shelter Partnership and as an AmeriCorps member at Resources for Community Development in Berkeley. He has a BA in history from the University of Michigan, and he's also the author of a report called Preserving Affordable Single-Room Occupancy Portfolios Across California, and that's how we encountered him and thought this person might have something interesting or useful to say about, about this situation. Next, we have Mike Alvidrez, who, if you don't know him already, I think many of you do, was the Chief Executive Officer of Skid Row Housing Trust from 2004 through June of 2018. Skid Row Housing Trust was a nonprofit that has been preserving, developing, and managing permanent supportive housing and affordable housing for more than 27 years. He's also an advocate of Housing First, and he'll maybe talk a little about what that means in his responses. Next, we have Claire Knowlton, who's the founder and principal consultant of Claire Knowlton Consulting, and she is the author of a report called Redesign Required: Lessons for Permanent Supportive Housing from Skid Row Housing Trust Buildings. So, two of these people very recently wrote extremely detailed and lengthy reports about like exactly what is going on. But I bet that many people in Skid Row have not read them. So I thought this might be a really great opportunity to kind of like showcase that research and the work that you all have done, along with some respondents, to kind of get at like what have we learned about about what's happening now. Okay, so the format of this event, sorry I've been talking I feel like forever, will be simple. I'm gonna ask 3 questions. They're each gonna answer those 3 questions, and then you're gonna ask questions. And we're gonna try to keep both questions and answers to a 5-minute maximum. In the interest of this people to allow everyone to speak. And so if you were here last time, you know that Tom really relishes the role of timekeeper, and so we will be keeping very strict time.
Oh, yeah, and that's the 5-minute big picture. Then when it gets down to 1 minute.
You don't want to see the sad faces. Okay. If that sounds good, everyone, we're gonna start. Okay, so the first question is just, and my questions are incredibly basic. First one is just, from your perspective, what is the biggest challenge for SROs in Skid Row right now? And I think we'd agreed that we're going to go this way, that way, but feel free to jump in whatever order makes sense.
Hi everyone, good evening. How is my mic? Do I need to get closer? This is okay. Okay. Nice to see you all. It's nice to be in an art space. I am a financial consultant, but I started my career running a community art center in Tujunga. Is anyone from Sunland, Tujunga? Okay. A forgotten corner of Los Angeles. So yeah, so nice to be here. I feel a little unqualified to answer this question because my work around SROs has really focused on the financial structure. How are they funded? Where does the money come from for things to happen? And obviously that has a connection to what the experience is like of living in an SRO and how well they are maintained, but that is one narrow slice. So I will speak from that perspective, the perspective that I understand, which is the narrow slice around finance, with full recognition that that is only one piece of the picture, only one piece of the puzzle, and so what I say is the most important, the biggest challenge or whatever, is not complete. So all those caveats. I think other people have much more qualified answers to this question. So from a financial perspective, if we think about our SROs as public housing, right, subsidized housing, where the subsidy is coming from the government so that the housing is affordable and has appropriate services attached to it, we have underfunded our public housing in a couple of really critical ways. So one really critical way is that the subsidized rent coming from the government sources that provide those dollars is just less than what it takes to operate. So, hearing the performers talk about security, we need more security. Yeah, and that security costs money. One of the things that was so interesting about doing I did a building by building financial analysis going back to 2008 of each of the Skid Row Housing Trust buildings. And I think folks probably know that after Skid Row Housing Trust closed, there was a court-appointed health and safety receiver that was put in place to manage the buildings until they transferred to new owner-operators. That first receiver couldn't handle it and got the boot within like a month or two. Second health and safety receiver came in. Put in a lot more security, a lot more janitorial services. And when the buildings ultimately transferred, those services got pulled back. Why? Because the cost of the added security and added janitorial services that the receiver was paying for, which the city was paying for, $40 million bill, they were spending more on security and janitorial services than the total money coming into the building for an entire year.
Except for the CEO salary, right?
So underfunded, extremely underfunded. And I will say, CEO salary, That's not going to fill this gap of what is underfunded. And we can always have conversations about what's fair compensation.
Yeah, it's $1
That's
million
worthy of
in 2
exploration.
years now.
It's not $1 million.
Yeah, $500,000.
So the resources coming in just for the operations are insufficient. And then on top of that, we have infrastructure that ages, right? Roofs that wear out over time. A roof does not last 100 years. Plumbing that wears out over time. Plumbing does not last 100 years. Really expensive capital projects that have to be addressed. So the money coming in on kind of a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis is not enough to pay for what is needed just for the operations. It's definitely not enough to save up for those big infrastructure projects. And then the capital sources, so kind of the other government pots of money that come in for construction, they're really focused on new housing. Very little is set aside to maintain the housing that we already have. So that's what I see as the biggest issue is lack of financial resources.
Me? Yep. Hi, Mike Alvidrez. I'm glad to be here tonight and see some old faces and old friends. So let me dovetail on what Claire was saying. So I was at Skid Row Housing Trust since just after it was incorporated. I joined up in 1990, which is why I have so much gray hair. And we were buying older SROs because a lot of them were being run as slum housing. People were on the street. The goal of the trust was to buy as many buildings as we could, fix them up, and get people to move into them. We soon learned that despite the fact that we were able to put together all that financing, the property management really sucked. Let's just be clear about it. It was really bad. And so we decided to form our own property management company as an affiliate nonprofit, which had two goals: to operate the buildings efficiently and effectively, and two, to hire as many local folks from the community as we could who could be trained to become a member of that property management company. So there was an economic development aspect to that goal. So we incorporated the management company in 1995 and recognized that this was a big challenge because no other nonprofits had done that. We felt we had to because we spent more time tracking what the management companies were doing than if we did it ourselves. And so I think I was in a line of people in the office and somebody said, "Who wants to start the management company?" And everybody took a step back while I was checking my watch, and so I got elected. It happens to me all the time that way. Anyway, so we did it, and the board said, form a management company, do what you got to do, and become self-sufficient in 3 years. Which wasn't hard because at that time, I think we had about 800 units in all of our properties that we owned by then. We did it in 2. We hired people from the community. We helped train them so they could become maintenance people, desk clerks, managers, and so on and so forth. So that was good because people were familiar with the community. They weren't outsiders trying to manage these things from some office, on Olympic Boulevard. And it really did instill this sort of community strength, this power in the community if you can tap into it, which is what we did. Over time, we developed a services component starting with harm reduction back in the 20s, not 1920s, 2000 something, I don't remember the exact date. Harm reduction was a very contrarian approach to things because folks who were struggling with mental health issues or addiction issues were often just blackballed from services, from housing. You had to fix yourself with your mental health before you could get an apartment. Getting an apartment always seemed like it was, up to that point, a reward for being compliant. By the way, that's one of the words I hate most in the English language is being compliant, okay? And over time, we moved from that to housing first, which takes the opposite approach. That says, it is almost impossible for many people to deal with the challenges of an addiction or a mental health issue living in the chaos of the streets. You can more successfully achieve some level of stability in people's lives if they have a stable living environment, right? So you don't have to get clean or have mental issues resolved. We accepted folks who didn't have those things, and services were not mandatory. They were not a condition of people living who could move in. You didn't have to go see a therapist. You didn't have to do this. They were all voluntary, and people participated in about 90% of the folks who moved in. When the services were structured with the resident in mind, they actually were highly successful. I think, as a matter of fact, when we opened the building called the Rainbow Apartments in 2006, one of the folks that worked at the trust, who was trying to hide in the back row there, Molly Reisman, she thought about, hey, what if we make the Rainbow Apartments housing first before it was ever mandated? And okay, that was my job at the trust, to hire really smart people and agree with what they suggested. So we did, and it's like, okay, you can make it work if you have the right components to do that. What we didn't know at the time, that all of our buildings require rental subsidies from the federal government, and most often, a lot of folks know Section 8, there's shelterless care, and there's project-based and all that sort of stuff, but basically they all work the same. What we did not know is that the Housing Authority was using an artificial means to keep our rental subsidies low. So they used a market study of about 1 mile radius, so that somebody who was getting a Section 8 voucher 2 or 3 miles away from downtown was getting a much higher rental subsidy than we were at Skid Row Housing Trust, because we were in Skid Row. You could only do that for so long before the operating costs, even when they're reasonable, are higher than the rental subsidy and the tenant rent, which is capped at 30% of their rental income. And so over time, these buildings don't pencil, meaning that the costs exceed the revenue that you're pulling in. Because we bought initially a bunch of older buildings that have very, very low baseline rents, and one of the things that came out in Claire's report was we always got the lower of, when the rents were subjected to a test, it's like, it's the lower of these two things. It's like, why are we getting the lower? It's a mentality that permeates through the system, where Skid Row gets the lower or the lesser of everything, okay? Because those people, well, they're, they what they are, right? I mean, so it's less. No, this should be the place where it's more, because we're taking in people that need more services, right? The costs are higher because these buildings are, when we bought them, they were 70 years old. I think the St. Mark's, the Persian, well, we had to demolish the old Persian. The new Persian is there now, but the old Persian was built in the 1880s. Now, when we first acquired and renovated those buildings, am I close to the 5-minute thing yet? I haven't seen that. I was going to time myself. I'm not thinking that Donald Trump. This is not Donald Trump's. Not Donald Trump's feed. I was going to time myself.
Wake up.
Okay, so yeah, we all of the older portfolio was causing us to sink. In other words, it was too much weight, and we tried to make it up for many years by developer fees. So when we develop a building, we get a fee. A lot of those fees were being used to support the older buildings that we bought in 1989, in 1990, in 1992. I mean, they were all old. The renovation dollars at that time were okay, but they weren't sufficient for long-term stability. And so over time, the trust was weighted down by all of these old buildings with below market subsidies. Just doesn't work. And so it was a challenge. And bad things happened afterwards, and there are probably people in this room that know personally what that was all about and what happened. But things went really bad afterwards. There's a whole other issue to deal with now, so that's it. Thank you.
we'll get into that next.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks, Mike. So I'm Marc Tousignant. I'm with Enterprise Community Partners. We're a national nonprofit, and our role is kind of to support the affordable housing field, really. So we work with groups like the Trust and SR Housing Corporation, and we're really there to help support the field. And a lot of it is around helping to provide funding to build new developments, but we've been focused a lot in the Southern California office where I'm based, just around the preservation of these existing communities. And it's been really, needless to say, difficult, I think, to get attention on that issue because, as was said earlier by these panelists, right, there's a lot of focus just on building new stuff, and that's a lot more attractive, but, we've been very much of the opinion that, we've invested so much in these communities publicly that it just makes complete sense to continue to want to reinvest in those existing sites, these existing communities over, future generations, so we can have these communities available for affordable housing, just given the affordability crisis that we've got. We kind of came into the issue more on a research level, I would say, looking at the supportive housing stock and a lot like the older stock, which a lot of our nonprofits are in possession of, and they're really struggling to find ways forward for these communities. So we noticed through some of the data that a high proportion of these communities are really SROs. Like 60–70% of the oldest supportive housing that LA's created are really these older hotels, right? So it sort of is the face of a lot of the older supportive housing sort of preservation issues that we've seen. So we decided to kind of dig in a little bit deeper on SROs, and so a few years ago, trying to get more attention from the city and so on and so forth to really say, hey, this is something that is a crisis, and unfortunately it took the dissolution of the trust, I think, to really understand that we're not just like bluffing here. Like, this is a real issue. Like, organizations are gonna, have to dissolve, go away. We're gonna have to obviously displace residents. Like, a lot of things can happen here. And so I think to answer the question more directly, I think the biggest concern, there's so many interrelated factors, but I think knowing the fact that like these organizations that, and we're really just dealing with the SROs that are restricted to be affordable, have government subsidies on them. I know there's other ones in private hands, of course, but the ones that are nonprofit or mission-driven nonprofits run, the model that might have worked, as has been noted, right, decades ago economically, it just doesn't work now. And I think what these organizations have had to deal with is going into their own reserves, their own pockets to try to basically subsidize properties that are largely facing deficits. And so that's resulted in a cascade of issues around maintenance issues, the inability to kind of reposition the property financially, quality of life, right, for residents, services, all that kind of stuff is interrelated. So the fact that organizations are so strapped now where they're getting literally $1 million, $2 million a year in reserves that they need to basically tap into to try to keep the properties going, it's just not sustainable for properties that are on thin margins anyways. And if you think about the costs that have risen so much more than revenue has, like insurance, maintenance, utilities, you name it, right? It's just way outpaced what we thought could work. So it's just a model that's not working as it was originally envisioned. And I think the lack of attention on being strategic about responding to it, I think, is a real concern. So we're worried that organizations, it's not so much, it's this whole canary in the coal mine theory. Like, what more can we see if we don't resolve this? Yeah. Are we going to see more Skid Row Housing Trust situations? That's the worry that I have. It's like, if we don't get on top of this now, and I think there's still time to do that, but it's going to take leadership politically. It's been very difficult to get that political leadership, but I think the opportunity's there. I think the awareness is there. It's now a question of what flexibility are we going to offer, and what are the resources we're going to find to try to do this. So I do think the likelihood is we could see more situations like this and more organizations that are saying, like we saw a recent article up in the Bay Area with Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation. They're having to get rid of 4 properties because it's just bleeding them to death right now. They just can't sustain that. And that's the sort of situation I think we want to try to prevent, because we really want to try to keep these in the right hands and try to preserve and revitalize these communities. They're such important assets in our community that I think it's a missed opportunity not to find a more strategic way. So we could go into more like what we found with the data at some point, but I definitely feel like this is something that we do need to address ASAP. Yeah.
Jerry Jones with the Greater LA Coalition on Homelessness. I had a meeting at City Hall earlier today, so that's why I'm in a suit. I bought it used and through the mail, and it was more blue than I thought it was going to be when it arrived, but I got used to it.
It looks fabulous.
Very good.
We can't even do
No, it's a very smart city.
It's a stunning blue.
Thank you.
That's
Thrown
the
on
biggest
me.
issue facing us.
The biggest issue
Lost
facing
30
us.
seconds. I'm building up to it.
I will, so I'm also realizing the benefit of where I sat is I can just fill in all the, there's not a whole lot more to say other than the obvious. The biggest issue facing SROs and hotels in LA serving folks who have experienced homelessness is they are very old. Much of the stock, obviously early 20th century, the Persian, 1880. So I'm very old too. So I did want to add a little bit of historical perspective because in some ways this dilemma, this crisis we're in is an accident of history. I'm old enough to remember, so I started working on homelessness issues in 1987. And if you read the news stories back in that first decade of what is now the era of mass homelessness, SROs were a big topic. In the Bowery and the Tenderloin and Skid Row, there was a sense that low-rent hotels were being demolished. The previous session here at LA Poverty Department went through some of that early history. And that vulnerable people who were very precariously housed in those buildings were becoming homeless in major cities. And it was initially in the 1980s, the big cities, where homelessness exploded in that first decade. And it was, for a lot of the country, it was kind of a shock if you went to New York City or Washington, D.C., and you saw folks living on heat grates. That was not what people up until then were really accustomed to seeing. Chicago, it started in big cities in a visible way, and there was this association of, well, part of what's driving this crisis is the loss of stock of the older hotels. And so we need to preserve these hotels. We need to turn them into subsidized housing. But they were not initially subsidized. So I think the other three panelists have mentioned that this is subsidized housing. In the 1980s and 1970s, SROs were just low rent, and there were plentiful. And so why is that important? Over the subsequent 40 years, I think it's fair to say now that most folks who are experiencing homelessness have never lived in an SRO. They didn't come out of boarding houses or any of these kinds of buildings. And that the homelessness we see all across the country are in communities that never even had much in the way of SROs. Yet in this early response to the era of mass homelessness, we invested in this stock of housing, which is now in many ways inappropriate for supportive housing. It's 60 to 70% of LA's stock of supportive housing. And yet it's owned and it's occupied, and to just say, well, because it's not a good fit for the solution we need in the 21st century also isn't a reasonable response, because there aren't ways to replace those units. But it is interesting, to me at least, to observe that this failure on the national level to grapple with mass homelessness in every part of the country is very much driven and tied to calculations that were made in former decades that now we're bearing the consequences for. I read, I was reviewing some of the older literature. So in New York City, for instance, more than half, in the mid-20th century, more than half of the entire multifamily residential stock for New York City was hotels, boarding houses, and SROs. So the fact that it's older stock, just to repeat some of the points that have been made, brings about the financial crisis we have, where the cost of maintaining these units just is not sustainable. And that the folks who are living in these buildings desperately need more security, need the plumbing that works. The walls are falling around their ears sometimes. These are very old buildings that are often in deplorable conditions. And we need to find those ways to transition to a more sustainable, more sensible housing strategy, but we also, in doing so, can't displace the folks who are relying on these homes.
Great, thank you all. Okay, so now the second round of questions is really, I know that it can be a dangerous game to engage in, like what would have, could have, should have. But my question is sort of like, is there something that could have been done at the level of the city, level of county, level of SRO operators that would have gotten us out of or prevented some of the things we're seeing now? Are there things you kind of wish had happened over the last 20 years that didn't happen? Is there any way we could have avoided this?
I see a responsibility at the federal level, which is where the subsidies are set, where the rules around how rental increases are given are completely divorced from the cost of actually operating. And as Mike was alluding, some of these different, like, how do you increase the rent? There's like the subsidy. There's like 6 different criteria, and you get the one that gives you the absolute lowest increase. So we see things like in Los Angeles, how many times have we raised the minimum wage over the last 20, 30 years, right? The rent increases, the subsidy increases, they don't match that. They're tiny percentages, fractions of a percent each year. So that's federal, and that's where I see like where things went wrong and could have been handled differently.
Yeah, I agree. I would say that in the mind of policymakers, I think, so largely a lot of the SROs that were redeveloped, both by SRO Housing Corp, Skipper Housing Trust, and some other organizations, you could see that as housing preservation. Okay, these are old buildings that need a facelift, they need to be improved and made better. And then they're not thinking about what happens in 10, 20, 30, 40 years. I mean, housing should last 70 years or more if it's built correctly, maybe 100 years. But preservation doesn't stop. It's like what you build today, you've got to preserve, 30 years down the road. You've got to think ahead. Now, unfortunately, policymakers are often constrained by budgets at the federal level, at the state level, and so forth. And so it's like, you don't think about, well, hey, we need to, improve the airport. There's a long-term plan for improving the harbor, or, our dams, our roads. Housing we'll get to later. That can wait. So somehow there is not long-term thinking about preservation must continue to what has already been assisted of necessity. People still need the housing. It's obvious we still have a problem with homelessness, like a huge problem. And even today's buildings, somebody needs to be thinking about the long term. Somebody needs to think at some point those buildings are going to need preservation. Okay? I don't think that's been on the radar. If it has, the radar wasn't working in downtown LA. So I just think that sometimes that public policy is framed by many pressures and external factors, and the political one is, I think, where a lot of pressure is exerted. Let's not get the housing budget out of control because we won't be able to do, I don't know, the Space Force or some crazy thing. So I just think that we need to think about essential pieces of what it takes for people to live decently, to afford food, housing, clothing, we need to think long-term because those are gonna be the same needs 30 years from now, 50 years from now, 70 years from now, because housing is such a critical element. We need shelter. I just think the mindset has to be framed in that way so we don't lose track and we don't preserve what we preserved 30 years ago. So anyway, that's it.
Yeah, it's really well said. I mean, I would echo that for sure. I mean, I'd like to think in a naive way it's a case of unintended consequences, but it's a case of if you don't actually plan for it and dedicate and be intentional about the long-term future of these communities, and it's just not going to take care of itself. We've seen that, right, with these forces. So, the folks that decades ago created these sites, financed these sites, regulated these sites, they're not around now, and it's like, okay, it was somebody else's problem to deal with down the road. We'll just deal with it when we deal with it. Well, that day of reckoning's come, clearly. I mean, we've seen that with the conditions that are in front of us. So, we believe strongly that it's a both and approach, right? We need to produce. Clearly, we've got, gaps in our supply around being able to meet our housing needs on low income side, but we definitely got to preserve as well. If you don't set resources for that, if you don't think about your policy making and be discreet about that, you're gonna miss out. I think we're where we are, and some of it's around awareness and education. And I think this is can get kind of, as you can imagine, gets kind of complicated and technical when you start talking about the issues and the solutions. But at the end of the day, it's about these are public investments that are providing a public benefit. And we have to commit to that as a priority. We have to prioritize what it's going to take to preserve these sites over the long term. And I do think it doesn't mean it's a one-size-fits-all approach. I mean, as Claire's research has shown, and certainly we've seen in the research, these are unique communities, right? They need unique responses. So just this sort of homogenous, we're going to treat it all the same. And we've seen that in the homelessness response. We think about the coordinated entry system, which I won't, it's a whole nother session to talk about that. But I mean, basically the thinking is we're going to use these same communities as our placement targets for the most vulnerable, right? The sickest and sort of most needy in our homeless community. And we realize that's not maybe going to work in terms of what's available within these programs, right? Whether it's the physical configurations accommodating services or the level of investment in care and the infrastructure around the services itself. It's just so, and we're seeing higher attrition, right? We're not seeing as much success trying to place folks, even though we know there's a demand for these communities. It's just not the ones that are being prioritized. So there's a lot of interrelated factors, but I do think it's got to be something strategically that has to be addressed. And I think the day has come for that. And unfortunately, I think we just kind of got caught up in the hot, sexy stuff, which is let's just create new stuff. Let's build what we want to build. Let's try to do what we can on that front. But we kind of lost sight of the cornerstone of our housing inventory, which is a lot of these SRO communities. I mean, this is a big chunk of what the early stock represented, right? Because that's what was available to the city to make available for nonprofits. So, yeah, I think it's a lot of that. It's just a lack of foresight, and some of it's just reckoning with, even if you didn't plan ahead, to just reckon with the moment now. And I think we've been reticent to do that. I think the trust situation has woken folks up tremendously. We have to continue to leverage that for what the best of it can be. Yeah.
Great points. Looking in retrospect, I think there are two other things I'd add to what should have been different. The first, I want to mention the containment zone. So it's not just that we have folks living in SROs in Los Angeles. The SROs that were preserved were in Skid Row almost exclusively. And the reason they survived in Skid Row and got knocked down in Bunker Hill or other parts of downtown is because, as I think probably most people in this room know, for decades the policy was homelessness is going to be dealt with in Skid Row. These 54 block, this area just east of the downtown is where we will concentrate services. This is where a lot of the SRO was existing anyway, from here, really Broadway all the way to the old rail stations. This was the concentration of homelessness. That's obviously also a historical artifact because homelessness is all over LA County. But it was a program designed with that assumption that if we have the SROs in Skid Row, then that's where folks will live. The second sort of mindset of the era was this notion that there will be resources for physical places. This was in the 1980s and the 1990s when SRO Housing Corporation and Skid Row Housing Trust were set up. We had a track record of decades of investing in, for instance, public housing. And Congress and it was primarily the federal government, would invest in the maintenance and upkeep and the rental costs of these complexes in perpetuity. And I can tell you, as someone who was working on housing issues in the 1980s, we were mad at the Reagan administration for cutting the budget, but I don't think there had been a reckoning in those years that, well, maybe this country actually is just going to walk away from the idea that we're going to spend billions and billions of dollars to maintain a stock of low-income housing for folks who can't afford the private market. And what has happened in the subsequent years is we don't spend that level of investment from the public sector. And a lot of what's in Skid Row was kind of predicated on an assumption that doesn't work anymore. And I guess the other, point I'd make it, and I'm rambling here a little bit, but if there's a thread through all this, we need solutions that actually represent the reality in which we live. The era of SROs and boarding houses and living in hotels where you're sharing a bathroom down the hall, all of that was built with private dollars. I mean, there was a time in this country when the real estate market was such that with land costs, with construction materials, with the labor of building stuff, you could make money with that kind of housing construction. Folks were building all kinds of things, but a lot of it was this type of housing. Fast forward to 2026, and that's not the real estate market at all, right? I mean, in my conversation at City Hall, I was having a conversation about the latest trend is luxury housing. This is not news to anyone here. It's shocking though how much. So in the years between the Great Recession and the pandemic, 87% of all multifamily in Los Angeles was what's called 4 and 5 star category, with multifamily luxury housing, 87%. It then dipped a little bit in the years following the pandemic, but now it's back up to new housing starts 90% of everything that's being built now, luxury housing. It does not, and the reasons for that aren't simply greed, although clearly real estate people aren't in business to get to heaven. They're in business to make money, right? And if you can make more money by building luxury high rises and condos and expensive housing, you're going to do it because that's where the money is. And unless the government is subsidizing you to build low-income housing, you won't. And so, as I said, the government's not subsidizing very much of that at all, and so that's not happening. That era of being able to build low-rent stock doesn't exist anymore. And so we need solutions that tie to the current world in which we live, which is to try to cross-subsidize or somehow tap into the funding that exists in the real estate market today, some of which then needs to protect and preserve the stock we have until we can replace it with newer stock. But I guess I'll just end by underscoring the point I made earlier, which is this is in some ways an artifact of a world that existed as the homeless crisis exploded, but is now very much a distant part that we're now trying to shore up and do the best we can with buildings that are reaching the end of their lifespan.
Yeah, I'd like to answer the second part of the question that says, is there something at LA, forget about LA for a second, or SRO operators could have done differently that could have created a better outcome? No. You're constrained by the agreements that you signed, regular agreements that says what you can do and what you can't do. And if it was up to the SRO operators to come up with a better solution, I think everybody that is doing this work would have done it. But the numbers don't pencil over time. I think the evidence shows. So we have, as an operator, we have very little discretion in terms of what we can and cannot do. So
You just can't underscore that point enough. Like, the regulatory framework that exists to manage these properties that operators are under is not, it's really clear, it's not conducive to long-term sustainability. So absent changes in how we regulate and treat these assets from like a lending and an asset management standpoint, we won't get there.
Well, both those comments I think tie very well into my third and final question, which is, where do we go? Like, what do we do now? Essentially, one of the things that Mary Callahan says really clearly in her film is sort of like, at a moment when half the SRO housing stock had already been destroyed, she's coming up with like, what's the plan? How are we going to save this? She's like, housing for poor people that's this inexpensive is never going to be built at this scale ever again, and so our only option is to preserve what we have. That was sort of, a big part of the notion that was baked into the creation of something like Studio Housing Trust. Now, obviously, I think each of you have in different ways underscored the idea that there is just not enough money coming in to pay for the services, let alone the upkeep for the housing, and there's all these restrictions that make that such that that's the only way that it can be. It does not seem hopeful about like what we could do at this point. So, connected to your idea, Jerry, of like reality-based solutions, what do you think can happen now? What is the way forward? Like, what does that look like?
So I think we are living with the consequences of bad tax policy, which was created by humans, and humans can create good tax policy. We can create a society that is kind and where we care for each other, and those for whom the system has worked really well and provided them a lot of wealth, they pay the system back for that. And those for whom the system is like not working so well, it's okay, because the people who really benefited from the system, like, they're putting money in and we're taking care of each other. Like, there's a world in which that is possible, and the models in other parts of the world for the way public housing works and social housing works is thought of on a very long time horizon. They think 100 years out, not 15 years out. The people who live in public housing, in social housing, are across the income spectrum. It is a shared public good. There are models for that. And we are in a moment where the federal administration really is into destroying stuff, is really into breaking stuff. They're breaking things right now. They're breaking the housing system further right now. The minimum subsidies that are coming through, like, a lot of those are on the chopping block right now. So we are in a place where the destruction is happening. What are we gonna put back? What are we gonna build back in its place when it's our turn to build back? Because I don't think we wanna put what's been there. That hasn't worked, right? These sort of like Reagan-era policies of disinvestment into public goods, like 40 years later, they don't work. So what do we want? Like, I think now is time for us to envision the way that we want public housing to function, so that, when it's our turn to set policy again, we are ready to go. We are ready to put in place the type of policy that is fair and kind and treats everyone with dignity and assumes that everyone, by virtue of being human, is deserving of a dignified, safe, cared for type of life. So that's what I want to see.
I agree. I think that because housing is a real estate activity, we tend to use a lot of terms that are all about real estate. So we talk about housing units and regulatory agreements and rental subsidies and tax credits and all that crap. And what's lost in the conversation is the people that actually live in those buildings. And so, I think particularly when the trust started to fail, it was like, what's going to happen to the portfolio of buildings, right? What's going to happen to the buildings? And it was less concerned, from my perspective, about what's happening to the people in the building. And so I think we have to, it gets really technical. You don't even want to know. It's all about real estate and all that bullshit. Okay, I really do think that, the community is in an ideal place to constantly remind policymakers, bureaucrats who work for the Housing Department, the Housing Authority, the tax credit. This is about people, really. It's a people program, okay? So it has to have a people first sort of orientation. Is that gonna change anything overnight? No. I mean, it's a mindset kind of a thing. That's gonna take a long time, and only if people keep reminding folks that make those policy decisions and funding decisions, this is about people. And if you do something bad, it's gonna hurt people. It's not gonna hurt the building. Buildings don't have feelings, okay? So I think that's what the community can do, is say, hey, this is about human beings, really. You could wrap all that other stuff around it, but it's at the most critical point. It's about people and what happens to them. And do you care about what happens to them? And if so, how do you make things better for people that are living out in the street? Okay, don't get too sucked into the whole, real estate lingo kind of perspective. It has to be people-centered. Just like every other important element, like medicine should be people-centered, and education should be people-centered, and if it's done right, it's got to come from that place. So that's not a technical solution to anything, but I think it's something that we have to constantly remind ourselves to not fall into that trap, and policymakers, bureaucracies, whatever, need to think that way. I always thought it would be a good idea if the guys behind the desk at the Housing Department of the state of California could come down and work in one of these communities to see what it's like, to see the real impact on a face-to-face basis, and not just from behind the desk before they, concoct the next policy on what's best. So anyway, that's it.
Yeah, that's great. I don't know any way around it initially than we dug ourselves in the hole because we were under-resourced. We're gonna have to resource this issue. There's a way to look at that short and long term. In the short term, we've got, as Claire noted, we've got roofs that need to be replaced, we've got elevators that need to be upgraded, you've got a bunch of basic building elements that are just not obviously at the level that they need to be. We can do some of that in the short term at a modest amount, while we're working on the longer term picture around where's the bigger money gonna come to really do the big rehab. We track these properties, these old supportive housing properties in LA every couple of years. We've been tracking about 50 sites, including the number that were with the trust at the time. And it's no surprise, we look at this list year over year, every 2 years, it's a lot of the same properties are on there because they don't have an option. They don't have any pathway forward financially. So that's just something, whether it's dedicated money, and we're beginning to see some changes on that at the state and local level, or incentivizing that kind of preservation work. So I think there's that. Secondly, I think, and then we've seen this up in the Bay Area, understanding that we have to stabilize our affordable housing universe, and so that means we're gonna have to be flexible with how we treat some of the requirements. I won't get too technical with it, but there's things that we can do with our current arrangements, don't need any new money to do it, to allow these properties to be a little bit more successful in the near term. And then thirdly, back to the issue around CES, what we've seen is higher vacancy rates with these sites. We've seen more sort of referrals that don't lead to a successful placement. We can do this differently in terms of our referral process because we know there's a demand for this housing. We're not necessarily aligning that with how our policies are around who we're prioritizing. replacement. So I would love to see like a unique matching policy specifically around our SROs. I think we all generally agree, right? They're not the best fit for everybody, given the limitations on site and the services that they have or don't have. And I think we can do this differently, so we're not setting folks up for success. It's in nobody's interest to have units sitting empty, folks that are on the street needing housing, and we're prolonging that because we're not being smarter about the matching process. So I think we can be more distinct about that.
That's a good one.
Great point. I guess what I would add, I've talked a lot about the past. So 5 days ago, some folks may have seen this in the paper, there was a motion at City Hall to rewrite Measure ULA. Measure ULA, I'll explain it if folks don't know. Measure ULA, the mansion tax, 2022. 98,000 signatures gathered. This was a citizen-led ballot measure to say we're going to charge an extra 4% on everything in the real estate market that's over $5 million. So it's mansions, it's also luxury multifamily housing, it's also commercial real estate. And the proposal on Friday was we're going to put this on the June ballot. We're about to vote for the mayor and some of the city council members. We're going to fast track this without a hearing to exempt the multifamily apartments and the commercial real estate for 15 years. We're not going to collect this fee from them. The ULA, Measure ULA, has raised, just since it was enacted by the voters, over the heads of the politicians, $1 billion. There's $1 billion. They've issued their first notice of funding availability. One of the eligible things in that notice of funding availability is operating subsidies support. Now, what is operating subsidy support? It's exactly what we're talking about. The buildings that are subsidized here in Skid Row get operating subsidies, have for years. But as Mike and Claire and Mark have explained, those operating subsidies don't cover the expenses of running the buildings. The rents don't make up that gap. We need more operating subsidies if these buildings are not going to be hellholes. And we can't expect the Trump administration is going to come in with more funding from Washington. They're cutting funding. But the voters of the city of Los Angeles passed Measure ULA as a local solution to the fact that we need a lot more money for affordable housing. And $1 billion is a lot more money. So I was at the city council yesterday when this measure was brought up, and the city council said, no, we're not going to put this on the June ballot. We're going to send it to committee. We're going to talk about this. The real estate industry has been fighting Measure ULA ever since it got passed. They didn't like it. They tried to keep it from the ballot. Once it passed, they sued to say you can't do it. They lost those lawsuits. And now they're pressuring City Hall to exempt the 4 and 5 star 90% of what's getting built now. And here's the kicker, and I won't prolong this because I know there's some questions for the whole panel on the things that have been discussed. They're saying, well, this is slowing development in Los Angeles. It is true. It is a fact that development has slowed in recent years. The reason, one obvious explanation for why development has slowed in Los Angeles relative to like San Diego, they've done the comparison, is if you have 90% of the luxury market being what's built, that's 90% of everything that's going on, and you have a slump in the luxury housing market, then there's going to be a slowdown in building more luxury housing. And there has been an overbuilding of luxury housing, especially in this part of town, especially in detail ag. We all remember the cranes, right? So there was a building surge before the pandemic. There is now, it's over 8% vacancy for the luxury stock. They built so much they can't rent it all. If they had built low rent housing, it would be rented tomorrow, right? But they overbuilt on the luxury. So now they're saying, well, it's ULA's fault that there's been a slowdown. That slowdown, incidentally, is over, as I said, because now the new starts are back up at 90% for 4 and 5 star multifamily, which means luxury housing is coming back. It's those interests that are telling City Hall, we need a 15-year exemption on Measure ULA. We really just can't afford to chip in for affordable housing. Every nickel of ULA is for affordable housing, deeply affordable housing, and operating subsidy supports that I think in the scheme of things is the only path forward if you want to see these buildings remain habitable. If you want to have the hundreds of millions of dollars it's going to take locally, not just to preserve what we've got, but to build new stuff. So that is current history. That is unfolding now. It's going to go to the Housing and Homelessness Committee. We've seen these attacks on Measure ULA ever since the proposal was written up and the signatures were gathered. We're in a fight again to make sure that the folks who aren't building what is needed and don't like to pay for poor people's housing, that we don't let them prevail. So, with that.
Yeah. Okay, so I have many more questions, but I'm not going to ask them right now because I want to hear questions from this room because I think there's a lot of expertise and perspectives in this room that are really valuable. We have like some of the wonkiest wonks you could ever imagine. We have people with real inside scoop. I don't mean to, I'm in a positive sense. Oh, okay. Sorry, I don't. So this is kind of like, a chance to kind of get into like anything you've ever been curious about. I tried to ask these really broad questions to get us kind of teed off so we could have like the context. But I bet you all have some like really, really useful questions. And we have kind of a unique situation here, so I'd love to hear them. I think, I guess, if someone else wants to be the person who's in charge of calling out people, they can. Anybody want to do that? Or I can do it? Okay, all right, I'll just do it. I want to try to institute the same sort of 5-minute limit on the length of the question, as well as a 5-minute limit on the length of the response.
That's about
But let's, I saw a bunch of hands shoot up immediately. Okay, wow, okay. Dang, I think we need to do a little cue here, okay.
I think Larry was first.
Okay.
Larry?
Yeah, hi. This is primarily for Claire and Mark, because you two dive most deeply into this. The obvious shortfalls in operating subsidies. Everybody knows about that. And you also commented upon lack of capital funds. And there are capital funds. They're going to brand new PSH that is sprouting up like mushrooms all over the city. And I work in one of those, okay? And if you want to know, the agency I work for is providing services in 56 PSH buildings, okay? Why are there all these damn new buildings when we got all this housing stock downtown? The reason is, was the reason in the previous series of panels about COVID, political will. Why is there no political will? Because there's political hate in, for example, my building, which is in East Hollywood, more than I work in. When it opened 2.5 years ago, Karen Bash showed up with camera crews, film, lights, camera action, and it was a major media event. Okay, that's why that money is going there. Why is that money going there? Because I also used to work outreach, and when I worked outreach, somebody would call some good burger who owns a single family house would call their council member. The word would filter down through like 5 different levels to me to go out to this encampment and clean it up, because it's all about the optics. People who are under a roof in Skid Row are not visible on the street, and the good burgers of Los Angeles just want these people out of sight. They don't give a shit. They really don't. They don't care. And pardon me, I just get really angry when you start talking about this. And to your remarks about matchers, we're housing navigators and lots of matchers. And these people are all under pressure to make their numbers, make their quota. The building in which I work is batch matched. It means we get like 4, they get bam, bam, bam. And that's all they care about. They are under so much, but lots of matchers, housing navigators, they gotta make their numbers. That's their job, okay? And as far as the sentiments expressed in the last question, yes, there are human needs. Yes, these are people. And what I've observed is the higher you go up towards in the policymaking levels, the more abstract homelessness becomes.
Yeah, they don't visit us in Skid Row.
Fuck no.
I don't think it's accidental. I mean,
No,
I
absolutely not.
Yeah, no, we know that. I mean, I mean, frankly, we're in plenty of conversations where you could literally, and thank you for sharing that, just because I think it's tapping into an emotion that I think we've seen in these conversations with leaders where there's such stigma associated with SROs. It's literally seen as a model or a housing type that's just out of favor, lack of interest, and so you're seeing that with the lack of prioritization in solving for the needs. And it's I mean, this is why we saw what we saw with the Skid Row Housing Trust, right? Like, it's just not a priority. And so you're on the front lines of that. Yeah, and it's highly regrettable, and I'd love to say, like, we're turning the tide on public opinion, but it's slow going. And a lot of the resources, you're right, they're there to help produce, not to preserve. And there's some technical reasons why that is. A lot of the programs just aren't set up for it, or it's even an eligible category, in some cases. We saw that with Proposition Triple H, which is a huge initiative in LA. If you wanted to rehab an existing building, it wasn't allowable. And there were reasons for that based on how it was set up. So we're not really, we're not setting ourselves up for success, but there is definitely a heated opinion that SROs at the leadership level. And I think people that's what you're saying with policy.
So I mean, how can we bring SROs to the forefront? If basically homelessness solutions, quote unquote, are all about political juice, political hay, and media opportunities. How do we bring SROs into that realm of financing, capital expenditure, ongoing operating costs, et cetera?
Great question. I'm gonna. Well, if someone has an answer for it right now, but I bet we'll get it. You can maybe tag that onto the net. I want to add one more question to the mix because we have a lot of hands up in the field. I guess Suzette, is that your Suzette, right?
I am
Suzette.
Yeah. Hello. I just want to say part of what you're asking has to do with political will. One of the things for Skid Row is that on a city level, we have not had city council council person really dedicated to Skid Row. Now they go every other place, and it's when we talk about political will, there's also some undermining as it does relate to colorism, because we're predominantly black here in Skid Row. So just understand, when I see pictures of people on Facebook and they're going to other places, they're just not coming here. Okay, even when we're their constituents. The other part is still good to see you, Mr. Alvidrez. You've mentioned Housing First several times, as other have. So one of the factors to me is LA County has implemented Housing First. They've implemented 11 of the 38 action steps. And therefore, we're not practicing Housing First to fidelity, which has to do a lot with the issues with, when we talk about, the issues of building maintenance. We have a lot of people who are living in the buildings who are not housing ready. So therefore, like the guy that lives 2 doors down from me, he burned down his first unit, his first semester in the building, and then they gave him another unit on the same floor, moving him next door to me. And then after they remodeled that unit, they put him back in his old unit, and then they were talking about moving him to another unit on the same floor. That's kind of what's kind of going on. We're bringing in now with Housing First model. We would, if we were following it to fidelity, we would not have overpopulations of people with severe challenges that are not being treated, and where we don't have staff on duty 24/7 to care for their needs. We literally don't have staff, period. And when we talk about security, security's like, oh no, I can't do that. Oh no, I can't do this. Property management, oh, I can't get involved with this. Oh, I can't get involved. I could go down a rabbit hole. So I just want you all to understand, when you're talking about the feel-good part of it, I'm talking about the reality of living in it 24/7, day in and day out. Because it's a whole nother feeling when my rights as a trauma survivor are being violated by somebody else because they get to have the right of harm reduction housing first, simply because they get to be continuing their drug addiction while my trauma is being re-triggered 24/7 and exacerbated. Thank you. Thank you.
If people have responses, you can, but if you don't, you don't need to. I mean, well, we can go to the next.
I'd like to respond.
Yeah, please.
Actually, the best program can be starved for resources, and when they are, they don't work properly. I stand behind Housing First with the appropriate level of services. I think one of the problems that we have with coordinated entry is that some folks who come through coordinated entry should have a different outcome than supportive housing. Some folks need to be in another higher level of care, I think. The way supportive, at least last time I was in the business. Coordinated entry is not, I think, a good idea. It's also mandated by HUD. But I think it needs to be tweaked so that folks that have that higher need of services and are not appropriate for supportive housing should be placed in supportive housing. And I think the system, if I understand it, there's no distinction. There's no distinction between folks that need a higher level of care and those who can do quite well in supportive housing. So I still believe that supportive housing is the best solution for many people. I think the coordinated entry system needs to be tweaked a lot, because I hear this from other providers. It's like they're all behind it 100%, but there needs to be some other option for folks that are not able to live in.
There's no higher level of care.
And it also seems to me that, SROs are so unique in that you are sharing bathrooms and kitchens. Like, it's akin to a family level of community and interaction. It would be really interesting to me to explore what would it look like for the residents of SROs to be able to have agency and decision-making in who they are sharing kitchens and bathrooms with, so that like the housing placement of coming into an SRO is more thoughtful of the community that is already there. And so who is going to be not just my neighbor, but like living in a family type situation, like level of sharing. I don't know how that gets implemented, but that is something that I think should be explored for the future of SROs.
Okay.
I think that was amazing.
All right.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is all really illuminating. I think that, I love the solutions that are people-centered, that are about housing as a human right, not as a commodity. But I also think we've been saying this for a really long time, people, not profits. I mean, how many rallies have I gone to? And that's what we're talking about in a lot of different sectors. So I guess my questions are oriented towards the short term and the funding that has been allocated in a variety of ways, right? And how we might be able to advocate for more going towards community and building preservation of existing stock, housing stock. I don't know what the data is for the renovations that have taken place in the SROs in Los Angeles, so that they are no longer separate bathrooms and separate kitchens. I'd be really interested in finding that out. I feel like we need to have a huge PR policy about saving rather than destroying, because I agree with Alice Callahan from the 80s that if we're not going to get the same freight of housing, these piecemeal projects where you get exemptions and then if you put in 10 units is not going to solve the crisis, right? So there's that one element. How do we actually activate around moving the money to be able to support in appropriate ways the kinds of care for people going into the SROs and for the physical plant or structure, while also advocating that this is a community of people, right? And that as we start shuffling the 10 people from this building over here and that building over there, we're not preserving community, right? So I'm looking for a couple of advocacy points or regulatory, how do we advocate for particular regulatory shifts that you're mentioning, right? We need to overhaul this, the ways in which the SROs are operated. So what are a few sort of things to wrap my hands around? I have to admit, I tried to take a series of courses on nonprofit financing of low-income housing.
How'd that
They're
go?
scam. Oh my God! It was just. I mean, how many PhDs do you need? 8. Okay, so that seems a level of where you have to know which boxes to check off, but now the money's not there anyway. So, what's the next model beyond it? And so I'm kind of asking those two sets of questions, right? How do we tweak what monies are available, and how do we actually begin to advocate for them, and also how do we what's the other model that's not just nonprofit?
To answer your first question, or at least try to answer it, I think that having people housed rather than homeless, and we'll just take downtown as an example, is better for everybody.
Right.
It's actually better for the business community. It's better for every community. And I think that it's been a polarized issue where the business community has, to a large degree, been resistant, which has been manifested in the politics. It's been manifested in the way people make decisions then and now about where funding should go. Mm-hmm. It's not good for LA. It's not good for any community to have people living on the street. It just doesn't work. I mean, who benefits from it except people that get built the luxury housing? But it's not good for them generally, as a community, as a whole. It's not good. And while you may be speaking on more on the part of people who are homeless, but the reality is it's better for everybody when those folks are in housing. It's just, it is, right? They don't recognize it necessarily. But I think that has to be said over and over and over and over. It's like, you guys, you got a big vacancy right in your luxury housing? Duh. It's like, just get behind solving homelessness and maybe you can fill it out, so you don't have a 20% vacancy. I care less about them getting, but my point is, it's like, this is better for everybody, right? When at least people are not in the crisis of homelessness for decades, right? For decades, so.
And Mark, you have data on the cost of rehabbing the units compared to what it costs to build new ones, right?
Yeah. I mean, if you think about, we've run some numbers on the older supportive housing stock, and we're at about, give or take, about $90,000 per unit to fully redo the building. I mean, that's talking seismic, energy efficiency upgrades, accessibility, compliance, you name it, in addition to all the modernizing of the building systems as well. Think about what it costs to build something new these days, right? Where we were at.
Are we close to $1 million?
Yeah, are we getting close to $1 million now, per unit savings? But on that question, I think it's going to require intentionality around the programming, and we're starting to see glimpses with ULA when we're first time the city's actually said, you know what, we're going to set aside money to preserve existing subsidized buildings. Years and years, right? Like if you think about the decades that we've been doing this work, we've observed that all of the public funds, a lot of financing out there. I mean, communities look at LA and they're like, you have so much money. But if you think about the fact that it's not necessarily set aside for this legacy stock, which is really what we're talking about, there's a reason why. So we're not competing well with these other programs. They're just not set up for it. And you could argue, let them do what they do best, which is produce new stuff. We need something separate to help preserve. So what Jerry mentioned around a shallow kind of subsidy to help with the gap on operations, setting aside money for rehabbing these properties, that's the right direction. The state's done a little bit of that too. It's just not at a scale. Right. It has to be at a scale to make the impact we need. So that's education, that's advocacy, that's more momentum and leadership to say, you know what, this works, we need to do more of it. And it's not an either or. Yeah.
I just want to we have 30 minutes left and I think 8 more questions. I know we probably won't even get through it, but I want to try. We have, let's do, yeah, let's.
Okay, hi everybody.
Hello.
Okay, so I wrote a series of questions based off of experience. So I'm hearing a lot of like the federal government this, the federal government that. We also have other agencies, the state, city, county, private funders as well, that also need to be held accountable as well. The CSC system, first question for that is, when it says it's based on our needs, like what needs are they saying we need to be placed? Like in the housing, is it for like mental, financial, like where is it getting its information from to place us in the houses that they place us in? And then also, is there a strategic system or society that is being used to have housed individuals become homeless again? Are owners, property management, service providers, neighbors, and law enforcement actively involved in these targeted organized crimes? And also, how can the cities, county, state, and federal officials have motels in high human trafficking areas?
Okay, 4 big questions. See what part of that you want to.
Yeah, no, great questions, but it's hard to connect the human impact that you're describing to the policy. I would say that one of the glaring gaps is clearly, as has been stated before, the lack of folks on site, the lack of supportive services, the lack of security, the lack of property managers, Suzette's points, that some of that would at least create the opportunity to stop some of the crime, the trafficking that you're talking about. And yet we are drifting into, I say we, not just Los Angeles, but supportive housing is drifting into a situation where there's really not supportive services for a lot of these buildings. As was mentioned earlier, I used to run the field operation for the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Been to, at this point, 48 states, visiting homeless programs, providers, sites. This is a nationwide problem where there's such scarcity of resources that that the situation in Skid Row with crazy things happening in these buildings is happening in other cities as well. It's almost it's the norm, and it's intentional. So I don't want to lapse back into like policy, but this isn't, maybe I'm conspiratorial in saying this. This is a plan to discredit doing anything to help folks who need assistance. And it's the same playbook they played on public housing. They starved public housing until these were absolute disaster zones, and then they knocked them down, and now they don't have to spend any money on them. There is a very well-developed strategic strategy by conservatives connected to right-wing think tanks on supportive housing. I don't know if folks are following the SRO Institute, the Manhattan Institute. The Trump agenda on homelessness policy so far is focused on this NOFO. If folks have heard about a NOFO from Washington, I'm not even going to delve into it. But it's a very layered, nuanced plan to say that housing people who are homeless, formerly homeless, is a bad idea. The narrative that's given is if you put people into housing, they will simply die from overdoses, or they are so mentally ill that they will be out of control. And so housing is not the appropriate intervention for homelessness. Now, the intent there is then to not spend money on housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. And I think if they're successful in pushing that narrative, they will succeed in the same way that we don't have pretty much public housing around here anyway. But I don't want to just ramble on, other than to say that it is fundamentally the right thing, and it is desperately important to bring people inside.
Yes.
Who need services, but then there is a moral responsibility as a society for us to give them the supports they need. And as bleak as it sounds, actually Los Angeles is doing a little bit more than a lot of parts of the country because we have local resources, but they're insufficient. But for parts of the country, I've stood in these units and buildings and talked to folks in other parts of the country where all they got is the federal grant, which is even less than what we've got, and we can see that we don't have enough. So I want to thank you for raising these questions. But the answer is we need to invest in the needs. We need to provide people with what they need if we're going to attempt to operate supportive housing, or else we probably shouldn't call it supportive housing.
I would like to know, how did you pass the housing inspections? You admitted they weren't maintained. Wouldn't the city shut down the buildings if it's slum conditions? Wouldn't it be better to relocate people instead of forcing them to live in slum conditions? And you built the Star Apartments, a multi-million-dollar architectural piece de resistance. Wouldn't it be better to admit that a single room occupancy model does not fit and allow families to move into these buildings? Single mothers, how did you legally deny housing to single mothers? What kind of policies can you set as a nonprofit that a landlord in Glendale, in Silver Lake, cannot set those policies? What kind of power do you have over people's lives? If you can't maintain buildings, let people move out. Give them money like they did with the Ford. They had to tear it down to the the frames, and build it. They relocate people 5,000, 10, I don't know how much thousands of dollars. Why are people forced to live in these conditions? How do you pass housing inspections? Because my source tells me they get paid. The housing inspectors get paid by nonprofits.
How do you pass a housing inspection? It has to meet certain standards set by the federal government if it's receiving a federal subsidy called Housing Quality Standards, HQS. How do you pass? You adhere to all of those requirements. You got to have. It's got to be habitable. I mean, to keep it short. Most of the buildings that we build, and the Star Apartments is not an SRO. None of the new construction buildings are SROs. It's a single occupancy unit, which is permitted. That means one person per unit. So it's totally within the allowable code. Yes, I can't remember all the questions, but I hope that covers it.
Yeah, how do you deny housing to single mothers?
Single occupants. This is a special allowable use for single occupants.
But they're living there anyway. They're just hiding.
Well, when we've had people who have had kids who were existing tenants, we relocate them so they can have more room for their family. We don't. I mean, it's appropriate, right? So.
It's not appropriate to discriminate against mothers
or to ask us
I'm
to
saying,
hire children.
I'm saying
so
we relocate people to a higher level of care so they have more space for their families.
It's discrimination. It's against the civil.
Okay, I'm not sure I agree with that.
All right, let's get to the next. Give you the next question. Yeah.
Okay, first I want to congratulate the panel and everybody in this room for this eye-opening, really understanding of what is happening. Now, I believe that there is no need for us to what should have, could have, or we could have done. What we need to do is know that there is no justice. It just is. And what we need to do is get on the offensive. Because being on the defensive of these budget cuts and everything will not win the war. We need to come up with a plan that will get everybody to unite, to come together with compassion and humanity so that we can lead with love to fight to end the need and the greed for the rich, to manifest a city that is built for the rich, so we can build a city for all. One that gives dignity for the poor. One that takes away what the rich want us to be. We are not sheep that they can keep, that we can just leap off a cliff because they're going to make us live in fear. So that we can get security, which is first in my building, which I have to say we need. Because without security, the managers will keep going because they're afraid to talk to the dealers. Because they're going to get, if you go after an addict that is not going to get his fix, they will stab their mother in the back. You can't take it personally. So all the managers are quitting. All the utilities are being broken. So we have to look at the long run, which is first, let's get security. Because with security, we have safety. With safety, we have unity. We can then have building meetings. We can then have Skid Row meetings. Because the community spirituality is what's going to embrace us to fight for dignity. So that we can get URL, so we can get the money that we need, that $1 billion. And what about a lottery? That we can then get so that it would go for maintenance. Because right now, there's 8 buildings in Skid Row that have no security. The Rivers has been flooded for almost a week. All the buildings are so old. As someone who's been in construction, these buildings need more money to maintain security and also maintenance. All the maintenance people are working 3-4 buildings. It is crazy. There's no way to make money, but we got to save these buildings. Whatever we do, we got to save them. So what can give us some seeds that we can flower to give us the power to devour the rich so that we can empower humanity once again.
Well, I won't restate your question. Positive values, I think, mandate that things that are essential to sustain life ought to be treated as human rights, as you're describing. Just like voting is a right. There should be a right to those things that sustain life. And any civilized society should guarantee that. But as we've been talking about tonight, we don't treat things as rights, we treat them as commodities. And we shouldn't do that. But the opportunities we have right now with the decisions that are on the table that will be resolved in a short matter of weeks about, for instance, do we preserve the $1 billion we've accumulated already to address the problem?
How can we fight that? What can we do? Can we get a letter organized? What can we do so that they can see us? They don't see us. They're hidden, and they keep everybody fears that they don't want to speak out. What can we now do here that we can start, that we can then take to our apartments, to our city, that we can then take to Karen Bass, that we can take so that in that week we can actually manifest an offensive to go after this, to stop this before it comes?
So this will be put on a public calendar. They will have a meeting. They will have public comment at that meeting.
1 minute. You get 1 minute. What can you comment? What can you do? We need to do something first.
No, I agree with you on that. And I think anyone who's connected to an organization that can mobilize, such as the Los Angeles Poverty Department,
we're here.
Or if you're connected to Los Angeles Community Action Network, or any of the other advocacy groups, this is, if you're working on housing and homelessness, I would say this is the most proximate issue you can impact right now is not to let the real estate industry off the hook.
Yeah. Those are ours.
The more distant we become from the obligation of showing up and speaking out, the less power we have as people, and the less legitimacy our society has as a whole.
Yeah, to not divide, to not say,
So
we need this.
I just wanted to make a quick point. Somebody was here that said, hey, we were doing that 30 years ago. She's right. This is a battle that's gone back
It's a war.
I'll never forget something that Cushing Gold Bear said, which is, if you don't have enough to eat, you can get food stamps. You can get support to help you have enough to eat. If you need a lawyer and you can't afford one, you get a public defender. If you need medical care, You can go to county hospital, maybe you have to wait 6 or 7 or 8 hours, but you get medical care. If you need housing, your name goes on a waiting list.
Yes.
Okay, and that's why I've always, people talk about a right to housing, that's great, you're on a waiting list, that's not a right.
No.
It's the opportunity for housing. I mean, again, this is a word thing, but I think we've got to change the way we use these words, right? Getting on a waiting list is not a right to housing. It's a list. Let's not pretend it's something other than that. So I think we all have to infuse that in the way that we think, and collectively, and through organizing, push people to think that way. It's the same stuff I was talking about. Let's get out of the real estate jargon. This is about people, and talk about why do we provide people with attorneys and with medical care and food assistance, but not housing. It's like there's waiting on a list is simply waiting on a list. And I think the waiting list for the Public Housing Authority is what, 10 years? I mean, people die on that list, they don't get housing. So a lot of it has to do with the way these issues are.
We have to insist to save what we have now, because we can't rebuild. They all need maintenance, they're all gonna fall down.
Yeah, I know.
They're all collapsing, and we need
Amen.
security.
Yes,
So
I
what
agree.
do we do now? We gotta do something now. Save these buildings.
We got about 10 minutes left. I want to see if we can get to the last of the questions. We got one there. And then people remember their numbers if they had number 4. Otherwise, we'll get to it. So you first, and then we'll move over here.
Okay, I live in an SRO building, the Yankee Hotel off of 7th and San Pedro. And I've been trying to, honestly, I've been trying to get out of these SRO buildings for
7 years.
I don't know how many years. I live with 4 cats, and I want my cats to live in a place that's safe. And because I don't feel safe I didn't feel safe in either one of the buildings that I lived in. And because of no security, for one. And then the building falling down around you. And I have this SRO voucher that's not attached to me, okay?
To the building.
It's attached to the building.
Yeah.
And I want to know how I can get rid of that voucher and get one
Years.
that's...
Well, there used to be, and I don't know if it still
Good
exists,
case
there used to
work.
be a program called Moving On.
Yeah, Hockla ditched that, like,
Oh, they ditched it.
several months ago. Bam.
And
Like on
they
a
didn't tell
Tuesday.
their tenants that it was
Yeah,
ditched.
yeah, on a Tuesday
Oh
afternoon.
my God.
Yeah, fuck yeah.
It's very difficult to get transfers.
No, it isn't difficult, it's impossible, Aaron.
So how can there's nothing I can do?
You need an advocate, you need a
Be a senior.
I would check with either inner city law or LA Can to see if there are other options aside from the program that they killed.
Oh, okay.
Inner city law is down still where the Produce Hotel 7's in the Central.
Yeah,
I think I know where that is.
Yeah. Check with them.
It's almost the same way as
I don't know.
I did get it.
And I would say also in February, the tenants union will start meeting here on Wednesdays at the same time, and they can refer to you. There's housing lawyers who attend that meeting, and you can also
The
get it out
tenant
from
union
them.
every Wednesday here.
Okay.
That's a good place to kind of get a sense of the specific resources. Okay, over here, and then
So-
we'll go this way.
I want to bring something into it that hasn't been touched on yet. I think there's so many important things that are being talked about. But in addition to all of this important stuff, which tends to be with policy, there's another dimension in this, which is raw corruption. So $150,000 in Jose Huizar's living room closet. A classic Skid Row story is the effort that we went through based on literally the city policy of how to create your own neighborhood council. So it was like more than a year's worth of like Americana, grassroots, envisioning, empowerment, boom, 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 all based on walking out step by step the policy and procedures that we were being given by City Hall. Well, what happened is they brought in online voting at the last minute, and property owners with the bids went to Delaware, because apparently you can do this really fast in Delaware, created an LLC that raised $50,000, and then hired Rocky DeLaGuido, former city attorney, to be a lobbyist in City Hall against Skid Row getting a neighborhood council. So what's the big deal about that? Well, all neighborhood councils have planning and land use committees, which have a lot to do with what is going to get built. And you know, all of these issues we're talking about, city charter is designed to create a mechanism called a planning and land use on a neighborhood council to deal with these at a neighborhood level. And when Skid Row went through the official city process to do that, it was literally a conspiracy of money and property owners and downtown power brokers who did their thing in City Hall to keep it from happening. So my question to, I'll include you, Rosten, to the five of you, in addition to all these policy things, do you have any recommendations, they could be advocacy points, whatever, to reduce the amount of raw corruption that exists?
Plug up the leaky bucket. I mean, I'll throw out one. You know, I think this is a common one, but it's, you know, the city charter is under revision right now. There is a movement to remove like land use decisions from being kind of like, there's sort of like a fiefdom for city council members, which is something where it obviously kind of creates a situation where a pay-to-play dynamic can really get energized, I guess, when you have, you know, different council members being in charge of land use issues in their district, or other council members who are deferring to them. So I think that's one really specific kind of structural reform that can happen, and we're at a moment where that can, you know, where that the city charter will be anew very soon. So that's one thought. Yeah.
So this is some years ago. There was a woman who was the planning director in San Diego, and she came up. Gail was her. And anyway, she took the job as a director of planning for the city of LA. And she mentioned in a conversation that in San Diego, developers could not speak directly to city council. Couldn't. And maybe, I mean, that sounds like a pretty damn good idea, but, you know, they should be able to talk to the city council person. But maybe only with some other people in the room at the same time, because, Jose Weezar, he's got, you know, took the cash and, anyway, I want to forward him that. But there have to be restrictions on the kind of access that developers have to city council people, because they support their campaigns, and it's like, I need, you know, we couldn't, when we did storefront, when we fronted on a street, we had all of these things that we had to do. Meanwhile, Jeff Palmer got a bridge over, what is it, Temple Street or whatever, and those two houses, two buildings that he has that connect. And the streetscape is horrible. It is like, it says no, do not walk here. Okay? Meanwhile, we had to do tree plantings. I'm not objecting to any of that. We had to light the streets and make it look safer and, you know, do all this stuff. He put a bridge between these two buildings, and his streetscape looked like shit, okay? And that's what happens when you have direct access to people with money who make decisions about what goes into their district. And I think that's a simple way, maybe to think about doing that. It's like, you cannot talk to them alone. You have to have somebody from other departments there, or something, or it has to be tape recorded or some shit. I don't know exactly. You get my point, right? It's like,
transparency.
Exactly. That's the thing. Yes. We could use a lot of.
All right. I think we have time for one last question.
There's an impending crisis coming in terms of applications to SROs, I think. Currently, we're seeing a massive institutional knowledge gap where providers simply do not understand their obligations under the VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act. Given that we're likely facing a significant influx of new cases soon, do we have a strategy to rapidly bridge the training gap before the system becomes overwhelmed and fails, and the very people it's meant to protect? And if you're not familiar, The VAWA protections are not limited to heads of household. If someone is sexually assaulted, they protect any person who is a victim of sexual assault, domestic violence, or stalking while living in or applying for federal assisted housing, you know, just so long as like they're a lawful occupant, which does not necessarily have to mean just not in violation of the building's policy. You know, like you said with children, some people just live there and under normal tenant in fact laws would be considered tenants, except for the SRO exception. You know, so they can't take that path to tenancy. However, under this, if they are sexually assaulted, which given how often it happens to me, I can only imagine the number of people who already qualify under this, who are legally owed housing and are able to hold the SROs themselves accountable, who only have a limited number of resources. So it's an incredible demand that is already well beyond capacity as more and more people find this out, because I think it just activated January 1st. So, thoughts, ideas, oh shit.
I'm not exactly clear on what the exact issue is.
Follow-up, like there's supposed to be protections, so if you're in a military family, the same privileges go to that family. Plus, there's also protections based on where you live. So if you are assaulted and you are an occupant, you do not have to actually be a tenant on the contract, but you are supposed to be rehoused. However, depending on where this happens, there's no actual process for that to be done. Lots of funding has been cut, or those processes have just been lost because there's no knowledge.
So a guest to the building is impacted
On,
negative.
on their property by either by a guest of a tenant, basically, or just like a tenant leaseholder, like themselves, because it's on their property and they receive federal money. It's automatic. There's this loophole, I guess you'd have to call it.
So they're not eligible for what exactly? So a guest is assaulted.
Immediate, cutting to the head of the line in, on the list, immediate emergency transfer for safety and reasonable accommodation.
A guest.
There are thousands.
Those are part of having
A
the forms.
lawful occupant, or what was the word they used? Let's see.
Well, SRO has one.
Affiliated individual.
Affiliated individual.
That's one of the terms they use. Lawful occupant, an affiliated individual, not leaseholder.
What? But when you speak up.
Just like how do you handle or anticipate this flux of people that are likely going to be legally eligible to jump to the head of the line, and this massive influx because so many people probably qualify.
We don't know.
The coalition that I coordinate is supportive housing developers, homeless service organizations, but also domestic violence agencies, because these three areas of service really don't talk to one another in a close way. And so this meeting where I had to dress up, we had a discussion about the need for City Hall to have more resources for survivors of domestic violence in the homeless service sector. And it has never made sense to me why it is that so often the prevalence of people who are fleeing violence is because they then have to leave their home and the perpetrator stays.
Or even worse, even if they get emergency housing, they're put into situations where they're living with people who just got out of prison and who committed the exact kind of crime that they're seeking shelter against. So that sort of person becomes their neighbor.
Before we go, just give a hand to these panelists. This exhibition and this series is very much about learning in public. If you have ideas of topics you want to explore more, these all seem like things we could do an entire evening about and get deeper into the things that are most relevant to this community. So please come talk to me after the panel and let's figure out what the next pieces should be. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you very much.